It was a cloudy and chilly evening, and I found myself walking through the old cemetery in my small town. I had always been fascinated by the history of the place, and I wanted to explore it in detail. As I made my way through the rows of graves, I couldn't help but feel a sense of reverence for the people who were buried there. It was quiet, except for the sound of my footsteps on the gravel path. Suddenly, I heard a noise that made me stop in my tracks. It was the sound of something dragging across the ground. I turned to see what it was, but there was nothing there. I continued on my way, but the noise persisted. It sounded like it was getting closer. I could feel my heartbeat quickening. As I approached a group of old mausoleums, I saw something move in the darkness. It was a shadowy figure, crouched behind a tombstone. I froze, unsure of what to do next. The figure slowly stood up, and I could see it was a man. He was dressed in ragged clothing, and he had a wild look in his eye. I asked him if he needed any help, but he just stared at me with a blank expression. I could see he was holding something in his hand. I couldn't make out what it was in the dim light, though. Suddenly, he lunged at me, and I stumbled backwards. I could see that he was holding a large, jagged rock, and I knew I was in serious danger. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of the man's footsteps echoed in my ears as he chased after me. I darted through the maze of headstones, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and my attacker. I could feel my legs burning with exertion, but I kept pushing on, knowing that I had to escape. Finally, I saw the gate up ahead. With renewed strength, I sprinted towards it, hoping that it wasn't locked. As I approached, I saw that it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and ran through, slamming it shut behind me. I paused for a moment to catch my breath, my back against the cold metal gate. I looked around, trying to make sure that the man hadn't followed me. To my relief, there was no sign of him. He must have given up the chase. I took a deep breath and began to walk home, my heart still pounding in my chest. The memory of the man's attack would haunt me for a long time to come, but I was grateful I'd made it out alive. As I walked home, I couldn't help but wonder what had driven the man to attack me. Was he just a disturbed individual, or was there something more to his actions? The mystery of that night stayed with me. From that day on, I knew I had to be more careful and vigilant in my surroundings. I had learned the hard way that danger could be lurking in even the most seemingly peaceful places. It was Halloween night, and Emily and Tom had decided to take a walk through their local cemetery. The full moon cast an eerie glow over the gravestones as they walked hand in hand down the winding paths. As they wandered deeper into the cemetery, the couple began to notice that some of the graves looked like they had been recently disturbed. The ground was uneven, and there were dirt mounds piled up beside the headstones. As they continued to walk, they heard strange noises coming from behind the graves. It sounded like something was digging in the dirt. Suddenly, a cold wind picked up, sending shivers down their spines. The couple looked at each other nervously, both of them feeling uneasy. They decided to turn back, but as they did, they realized they had become disoriented and weren't sure which way they had come from. Panic set in as they wandered aimlessly through the rows of graves, the wind howling around them. They tried to call for help, but their phones had no signal. As they stumbled through the dark, they began to hear a strange chanting coming from somewhere in the cemetery. The sound grew louder and more intense, and the couple could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. Suddenly, they saw a group of people dressed in black robes emerging from behind a large mausoleum. The chanting grew louder as the groups approached them. The couple tried to run, but they were quickly surrounded. The people in robes were holding torches, their faces obscured by the flickering light. One of them stepped forward and spoke in a low, ominous voice. "We've been waiting for you." The couple tried to back away, but they were trapped. The group of people began to move closer, the chanting growing louder and more frenzied. Just as the couple thought it was over, they heard the sound of police sirens in the distance. The group scattered, disappearing into the night. The couple was shaken, but grateful to be alive. They were found by the police, who had been called by a concerned passerby who had seen the robed figures in the cemetery. As they were escorted out, the couple couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if the police hadn't arrived. They knew they had been lucky to make it out alive, and they vowed never to go back to that cemetery again. It was a cool autumn night, and a group of 5 teenagers decided to venture into the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. They had heard stories of the graveyard being haunted by restless spirits, but they had always laughed it off as superstition. As they wandered through the graves, they heard strange noises and saw shadows moving in the darkness. They laughed and joked nervously, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, one of the teenagers, a boy named Max, disappeared. The others searched frantically for him, calling out his name, but he was nowhere to be found. After searching for hours and coming up empty-handed, the teens figured that Max might have just gone home on his own accord, and decided to leave. Upon calling Max's home, their suspicions had been confirmed, as Max had just arrived home minutes before they called. They were relieved, but also they were unsettled by the fact that Max would abandon them there. The next day, Max showed up at school, but he was different. He looked pale and shaken, and he refused to talk about what had happened to him in the cemetery. The other teenagers tried to get him to open up, but he just shook his head and walked away. Over the next few weeks, strange things started to happen to the teenagers. They would hear footsteps in their houses when no one else was home, or they would see shadows moving out of the corner of their eyes. They all started to feel like they were being watched, like something was following them. One day, the group of friends ran into Max at a coffee shop. He was jittery and nervous, and he kept looking over his shoulder. The other teens asked him again what had happened in the cemetery, and this time, he finally spoke. He told them that he had been exploring one of the graves when he had fallen through the ground into a dark tunnel. He had crawled through the tunnel, and it had led him to a room deep underground. In the room, he had seen things that he couldn't explain, things that had terrified him to his core. He refused to say any more than that, and the other teens could see the fear in his eyes. They knew that he had experienced something truly terrifying in that cemetery, something that had changed him forever. From that day on, the teenagers never went back to the cemetery. They knew that something was watching them, something they couldn't explain or understand. And they knew they never wanted to experience the terror that Max had gone through, the terror that is still unknown.